The 2022 FIA Formula One World Championship is a motor racing championship for Formula One cars which is the 73rd running of the Formula One World Championship. It is recognized by the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, the governing body of international motorsport, as the highest class of competition for open-wheel racing cars. The championship is contested over 22 Grands Prix, which are held around the world, and it is scheduled to end earlier than in other recent years to avoid overlapping with the FIFA World Cup. Drivers and teams are competing for the titles of World Drivers' Champion and World Constructors' Champion, respectively. The 2022 championship saw the introduction of significant changes to the sport's technical regulations. These changes had been intended to be introduced in 2021, but were delayed until 2022 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Max Verstappen, who was the reigning drivers' champion, claimed his second title at the Japanese Grand Prix, while his team, Red Bull Racing, achieved their fifth World Constructor Championship, and first since 2013, at the following United States Grand Prix. Mercedes were the reigning Constructors' Champions. Entries. The following constructors and drivers are currently under contract to compete in the 2022 World Championship. All teams compete with tires supplied by Pirelli. Each team is required to enter at least 2 drivers, one for each of the 2 mandatory cars. Free practice drivers. Each team is required to field a driver who has not taken part in more than 2 Grands Prix in at least 2 sessions of Grand Prix weekends, one for each car entered in the championship. A number of drivers were entered at selected events to drive in free practice. Team changes. Honda announced that they would not supply power units beyond 2021. The company had provided power units to Scuderia AlphaTauri since 2018 and to Red Bull Racing since 2019. Red Bull Racing have since taken over Honda's engine program and manage it in-house, under a new division called Red Bull Powertrains. The decision was made after lobbying the other 9 teams to negotiate an engine development freeze until 2025. Red Bull Racing acknowledged that they would have left the championship if the engine development freeze had not been agreed to, as they could not develop a brand new engine, and both Red Bull Racing and Renault were unwilling to resume their former partnership. Driver changes. Prior to the 2021 Dutch Grand Prix, Kimi Räikkönen announced his intention to retire at the end of the championship, ending his Formula One career after 19 seasons. Räikkönen's seat at Alfa Romeo was filled by Valtteri Bottas, who left Mercedes at the end of 2021. George Russell replaced Bottas, vacating his seat at Williams, which was filled by former Red Bull Racing driver Alexander Albon. Formula 2 driver Zhou Guanyu graduated to Formula One with Alfa Romeo, in place of Antonio Giovinazzi, who left the team at the end of 2021. Zhou became the first Chinese driver to compete in Formula One. Nikita Mazepin was originally due to compete for Haas for a second consecutive year. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resultant cancellation of Uralkali's title sponsorship, his contract was terminated. He was replaced by Kevin Magnussen, who last competed in 2020 with the same team. Mid-season changes. Calendar. The 2022 calendar consists of 22 events. Calendar expansion and changes. The Australian, Canadian, Japanese, and Singapore Grands Prix returned to the calendar after a 2-year absence due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Miami Grand Prix made its debut, with the race taking place at the Miami International Autodrome in Miami Gardens, Florida. The Portuguese, Styrian, and Turkish Grands Prix were not included in the list of 2022 races. These Grands Prix were specifically added to the 2021 calendar in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, to ensure that as many races as possible could be held. The Qatar Grand Prix, which made its debut in the 2021 championship at the Lusail International Circuit, is not present on the 2022 calendar. The Grand Prix is planned to return in 2023, originally scheduled to be moved to a new purpose-built circuit, after a one-year hiatus during which the country would focus on hosting the FIFA World Cup, before being set to remain in Lusail. The Chinese Grand Prix was under contract to feature on the 2022 calendar, but was not included due to Chinese travel restrictions related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Grand Prix is due to return in the 2023 championship. The Russian Grand Prix, which was scheduled to take place on September 25 as the 17th round of the championship, was initially suspended from the calendar in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, before being ultimately cancelled. The Grand Prix was due to be replaced, but that plan was later scrapped. Regulation changes. Race direction. Michael Macy, who had served as race director since the death of Charlie Whiting in 2019, was removed from the role of race director after an inquiry into the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. As part of a restructuring of race control, Macy was replaced by former DTM race director Niels Wittek and World Endurance Championship race director Eduardo Freitas. The pair have assumed the role on an alternating basis. Herbie Blash, Whiting's former deputy, was appointed as permanent senior advisor to the race director. The FIA also introduced a new virtual race control system, much like the video assistant referee in football, as well as a ban on team communications that lobby race officials. Radio between teams and FIA officials also is no longer broadcast on television in order to protect race officials. Unlapping procedures were reassessed by the Formula One Sporting Advisory Committee following the controversy of the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and presented prior to the start of the season. Prior to the United States Grand Prix, the FIA abandoned the idea of rotating race directors, leaving Niels Wittek as the sole serving race director for the final 4 rounds of the championship. The rotation policy was not met with favorable reviews from drivers, as well as being in response to criticism of Eduardo Freitas's performance as race director at the Japanese Grand Prix. Technical regulations. The 2022 World Championship saw an overhaul of the technical regulations. These changes had been planned for introduction in 2021, with teams developing their cars throughout 2020. The introduction of the regulations was delayed until the 2022 championship in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Once the delay was announced, teams were banned from carrying out any development of their 2022 cars during the 2020 calendar year. Prior to the season, the FIA said it anticipated that the car performance deficit between the fastest and slowest teams on the grid would be cut by half when compared to 2021. Drivers were consulted on developing the new technical regulations, which were deliberately written to be restrictive so as to prevent teams from developing radical designs that limited the ability of drivers to overtake. The FIA created a specialist working group, or committee of engineers, tasked with identifying and closing loopholes in the regulations before their publication. The elimination of loopholes will, in theory, stop one team from having a dominant car, and in turn allow for closer competition throughout the field while improving the aesthetics of the cars. This philosophy was a major aim of the new regulations. Red Bull car designer Adrian Newey noted that the regulation changes were the most significant in Formula One since the 1983 season. Aerodynamics and bodywork. Mid-season aerodynamics directive. Power units. Standardized components. Tires. Sporting regulations. Sprint points system and events. Points system for shortened races. Safety car procedures and protocols. Starting tire choice. Financial regulations. In July, ahead of the 11th round, the Austrian Grand Prix, it was announced that the planned spending allowance of $141.2 million would be increased by 3.1% after concerns that high inflation could lead to several teams spending over the originally planned budget cap. Season summary. Pre-season. Due to the change in technical regulations, Formula One decided to hold 2 winter tests at 2 different tracks to help teams gather more data on their new cars, with Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya in Montmeló hosting the first on 23-25 February and Bahrain International Circuit in Sakhir hosting the second on 10-12 March. Opening rounds. Charles Leclerc took pole position for the Bahrain Grand Prix. For the first time since the 2019 Brazilian Grand Prix, both Haas drivers got through into Q2, with Kevin Magnussen qualifying 7th and Mick Schumacher 12th. In the opening lap at turn 6, Alpine's Esteban Ocon touched the rear of Schumacher's car, spinning him round, and was penalized 5 seconds for the accident. AlphaTauri's Pierre Gasly caught fire and retired on lap 46. Leclerc won the Grand Prix ahead of teammate Carlos Sainz Jr., making it a 1-2 finish for Ferrari. Magnussen finished 5th, while the Red Bull cars of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez retired late in the race due to fuel issues. Perez took pole position for the first time at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, while Mercedes's Lewis Hamilton claimed 16th place after being knocked out in Q1 for the first time since the 2017 Brazilian Grand Prix. Only 18 drivers started the race, as Yuki Tsunoda's AlphaTauri broke down on the way to the grid after a suspected drivetrain issue, and Schumacher was withdrawn from the event after a crash in qualifying. He would return to racing in the next round. Williams's Nicolas Latifi hit the wall at the final corner on lap 16, while Alpine's Fernando Alonso, McLaren's Daniel Ricciardo, and Alfa Romeo's Valtteri Bottas retired after 38 laps due to technical problems. Verstappen won the race after a late overtake on Leclerc. Williams's Alexander Albon got a 3-place grid penalty after the race for a collision with Aston Martin's Lance Stroll. Leclerc won the Australian Grand Prix from pole position, set the fastest lap, and led every lap, getting the first Grand Slam for Ferrari since Alonso at the 2010 Singapore Grand Prix. Perez and Mercedes's George Russell took 2nd and 3rd, respectively. Perez's teammate Verstappen was running 2nd before he retired on lap 38 due to fuel leaks causing a fire. Sainz spun out on the opening lap at turn 10 and Aston Martin's Sebastian Vettel, who made his season debut after missing the first 2 races as he tested positive for coronavirus with Nico Hülkenberg taking his place, crashed out in the opening stages at turn 4. Albon, who started last after he was disqualified from qualifying for failing to provide a 1-liter fuel sample, finished 10th for Williams, pitting on the last lap after running 57 laps on hard tires. Verstappen took pole position for the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix sprint. Despite Leclerc overtaking him at the start, Verstappen recovered, using DRS to overtake him and win the sprint, ahead of Leclerc and teammate Perez. Verstappen won Sunday's Grand Prix from pole position to achieve the 2nd Grand Slam of his career, while Perez finished in 2nd to give Red Bull their first 1-2 finish since the 2016 Malaysian Grand Prix. Leclerc ran in 3rd for the most of the race but spun on lap 53, falling to 9th and promoting McLaren's Lando Norris to the final podium place. Leclerc would recover to eventually finish in 6th position. The result promoted Red Bull to 2nd in the Constructors' Championship, and Verstappen to 2nd in the Drivers' Championship, with Leclerc's teammate Sainz suffering a 2nd DNF in a row following a lap 1 collision with Daniel Ricciardo. Leclerc led Sainz for a Ferrari front row lockout for the first edition of the Miami Grand Prix. Behind them were the Red Bull drivers, Verstappen and Perez, and Alfa Romeo's Bottas. Stroll and Vettel, who respectively qualified 10th and 13th, started the race from the pit lane after a fuel temperature issue. At the first corner on the opening lap, Verstappen overtook Sainz for second place and closed in on Leclerc, whom he passed for the lead on lap 9, as Leclerc struggled with the medium compound tires. The race was neutralized on lap 41, as Norris's rear right tire made contact with Gasly's front left, triggering a virtual safety car and then a safety car for 5 laps. Verstappen was pressured from Leclerc at the restart, and defended his position to take the win. On lap 52, his teammate Perez attempted to overtake Sainz into turn 1 but made a mistake and locked up. Vettel and Schumacher collided at lap 53, but no action was taken. Leclerc and Sainz finished second and third, respectively, while Perez, who had temporarily suffered engine issues that cost him about 30 horsepower, and Russell made up the top 5. After the race, Alonso was given 2 separate 5-second penalties and finished outside of points. Magnussen had 2 separate incidents following the restart with Stroll, retiring on the last lap. Leclerc took pole position for the Spanish Grand Prix, which he led until being forced on lap 27 to retire due to a turbo and MGUH failure. Despite DRS issues, Verstappen won the race, with Perez letting him by on lap 49. As they were on different strategies, Russell completed the podium. Sainz had a bad start that dropped him from 3rd to 5th, and also spun at turn 4 on lap 7 due to wind gust, followed by Verstappen due to similar issues at the same turn on lap 9, but Sainz recovered from 11th to finish 4th, ahead of Hamilton, who also made a comeback from 19th. After suffering a puncture in a racing incident with Magnussen at turn 4 after the start. For the first time in the season, Red Bull led Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship, while the Drivers' Championship standings switched from a 19-point Leclerc lead to a 6-point advantage for Verstappen. Leclerc claimed pole position for the Monaco Grand Prix, in front of Sainz and Perez. 2 formation laps were run, 16 minutes after the scheduled start time. The start was aborted, and started 50 minutes later. Due to a strategy error, Leclerc fell to 4th place behind Verstappen and Sainz, with Perez leading the race. Ocon and Hamilton made contact on lap 18, the former getting a 5-second time penalty. 5 laps after Magnussen retired due to water pressure loss, Schumacher spun near the swimming pool section, splitting his car in 2 and causing the race to be stopped. The race was won by Perez, followed by Sainz, Verstappen, Leclerc, and Russell. Mid-season rounds. Leclerc once again claimed pole position for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, in front of Perez and Verstappen. Perez immediately overtook Leclerc in turn 1 and held the lead until lap 15. Where Verstappen overtook him. On lap 9, the virtual safety car was deployed after Sainz stopped at turn 4, due to a hydraulic issue. Then, on lap 20, after briefly taking the lead of the race, Leclerc suffered a power unit issue and pulled into the pits. Magnussen and Zhou also retired from the race. Tsunoda was shown the black and orange flag for a DRS failure, which was fixed with speed tape, and him dropped to 13th. Williams's Latifi received a 10-second stop-and-go penalty after for a grid infringement and was later given a 5-second time penalty for ignoring blue flags. Verstappen took pole position for the Canadian Grand Prix, which returned to the calendar after a 2-year absence, after a wet qualifying session. Alpine's Alonso started second, ahead of Sainz, while Leclerc started from the back of the grid after exceeding his quota of power unit components. Perez started 13th following a crash in qualifying. Perez retired on lap 8 with gearbox issues, while technical problems for Schumacher forced him to retire on lap 20. Tsunoda crashed on lap 49, bringing out the safety car and allowing Sainz to close in on Verstappen and chase down the Red Bull driver in the closing stages. Despite this, Verstappen won the race from Sainz and Hamilton, while Leclerc climbed up to 5th. Alonso was given a 5-second post-race penalty for making more than one change of direction to defend a position, dropping him down from 7th to 9th. Sainz claimed his first pole position at the British Grand Prix. Verstappen overtook him at turn 1, before the race was red flagged and was restarted with original positions, meaning Sainz started first again. He kept first position off the second start, before being overtaken by Verstappen several laps in. Verstappen picked up damage to his floor and dropped down to 7th. Sainz was then overtaken by Leclerc. Sainz, Perez, and Hamilton all pitted for new tires under safety car. With newer tires, Leclerc was then overtaken by all three, dropping him down to 4th. Sainz won his first ever Formula One race. Verstappen qualified on pole and won the second sprint of the championship at the Austrian Grand Prix. He was overtaken 3 times at various points by Leclerc, who eventually won the race. Sainz was quicker than Verstappen and was on for an easy 1-2, before a power unit issue saw him retire, leaving Verstappen second and promoting Hamilton to third. Russell took his maiden pole position at the Hungarian Grand Prix while Red Bull Racing struggled in qualifying, with Verstappen suffering MGUK problems and Perez unable to get a clean lap in Q2, leaving them 10th and 11th on the grid. Verstappen made a strong recovery drive, working his way up the order with better strategy and pace. Verstappen won from Hamilton, who recovered from 7th, following a DRS failure in qualifying. Russell came third after being passed by Hamilton with 5 laps to go. Sainz and Leclerc finished 4th and 6th respectively after questionable strategy calls from the Ferrari pit wall. The Belgian Grand Prix was the first race held after the August break, with several drivers taking on additional components and incurring grid penalties for doing so. Sainz started the race from pole. Alonso and Hamilton made contact after a scrap at Les Combes. Hamilton was forced to retire his car shortly afterwards, and an incursion between Latifi and Bottas on the second lap drew out the safety car. Verstappen made quick work of the cars ahead at the restart, with Perez following to secure a 1-2 finish for Red Bull Racing. Sainz rounded out the podium. Leclerc pitted for new soft tires on the penultimate lap to make an attempt at the fastest lap and incurred a time penalty for speeding in the pit lane, demoting him to 6th at the conclusion of the race. At the Dutch Grand Prix, Verstappen was able to beat Leclerc to pole at his home race. On lap 45, Tsunoda pulled over with an issue on the front left tire. Tsunoda was told to continue and came in a lap later, for a change of tires and to tighten his seatbelt, which he had loosened as he prepared to abandon his car. On lap 47, Tsunoda retired with a differential issue. This brought out a virtual safety car, allowing Verstappen to make a pit stop to keep the lead ahead of the 2 Mercedes. On lap 55, Bottas retired with an engine issue, bringing out a full safety car. Verstappen overtook Hamilton at the restart almost immediately, while Sainz received a 5-second penalty for an unsafe release during his pit stop. After Russell made a split-second decision to pit again for faster softs, he overtook Hamilton, who fell to 4th after being overtaken by Leclerc as well. Following the race, a conspiracy theory emerged accusing Red Bull Racing strategist Hannah Schmitz of conspiring with sister team AlphaTauri to ensure a favorable result for Verstappen, after questioning the nature of Tsunoda's retirement. The incident was looked into by race stewards, whose only action was to reprimand Tsunoda for having his belts undone. Leclerc took pole at the Italian Grand Prix with Verstappen taking second. He, alongside Sainz and Hamilton, took penalties for replacing components. Verstappen started from 7th, but reached second by lap 5, behind Leclerc who had held successfully defended first position. After Vettel experienced an engine failure on lap 10, Leclerc pitted under the virtual safety car. Verstappen would then lead the race until he pitted on lap 26. Alonso's Alpine would then be retired because of a water pressure issue on lap 31, but was returned to the pit lane to avoid any disruptions to the race. Leclerc made a second pit stop on lap 34, again giving Verstappen the lead. Stroll retired on lap 39 and on lap 47, Ricciardo stopped his car on the side of the track and a safety car was deployed. Verstappen held the position and won under the safety car. Closing rounds. The Singapore Grand Prix was the first race wherein Verstappen could mathematically win the championship. He had to outscore Leclerc by 22 points, Perez by 13 and George Russell by 6. If Verstappen came first with the fastest lap while Leclerc came 8th or lower and Perez came 4th or lower, or if Verstappen came first without the fastest lap while Leclerc came 9th or lower and Perez came either 4th without fastest lap or 5th with, Verstappen would be the champion. Leclerc was on pole after Verstappen abandoned 2 qualifying laps, the first due to traffic, and the second to ensure there would be enough fuel for the governing body to take a sample at the end of the session, thus avoiding a disqualification from the qualifying session. Verstappen started from 8th. The race was delayed by over an hour due to thunderstorms. Perez won the race, followed by Leclerc and Sainz. Verstappen came 7th. Following Verstappen's failure to secure the championship at the Singapore Grand Prix, there were several permutations that could net him the championship at the following Japanese Grand Prix. He needed to outscore Leclerc by 8 points and Perez by 6. Verstappen would secure pole, in front of Leclerc, Sainz, and Perez. The race began on time despite poor weather, and was red flagged after 2 laps following an accident involving Sainz. The deployment of the recovery vehicle during the red flag was criticized, Gasly narrowly missing it in poor weather conditions. Gasly angrily remonstrated that could have killed if he had lost control and hit the vehicle, even at reduced speed. The race resumed at 16:15 local time behind the safety car. Only 28 laps were completed before the race was curtailed due to it passing the 3-hour time limit. Verstappen won by just under 27 seconds, with Leclerc coming second and Perez coming third. After an investigation involving the latter two in the final lap, Leclerc was handed a 5-second penalty, meaning he came third behind Perez. As the race was successfully completed, full points were awarded despite confusion that only partial points were on offer due to the reduced total length of the race. Verstappen was crowned world champion, having an insurmountable lead of 113 points, with only 112 still available. Results and standings. Grands Prix. Scoring system. Points are awarded to the top 10 classified drivers, the driver who set the fastest lap during the Grand Prix, and the top 8 of the sprint. In the case of a tie on points, a count-back system is used where the driver with the most Grand Prix wins is ranked higher. If the number of wins is identical, then the number of second places is considered, and so on. If this procedure fails to produce a result, the FIA will nominate the winner according to such criteria as it thinks fit. The points are awarded for every race using the following system. World Drivers' Championship standings. Notes. Driver did not finish the Grand Prix but was classified, as he completed more than 90% of the race distance.